Hey guys and gals out in interwebs land, welcome to Miyagi Mornings Thursday edition 50, I don't know, 9, I don't know what episode this is, it doesn't matter. It's Thursday and it is February the 25th, so it's that edition, and you can look in the title to see what number it is since I can't remember it. What I do know is what we're going to talk about today. This comes from a question on the MeWe thread for Miyagi Mornings. Comes from Sue, and Sue says, if you had a decent soil situation on your property, what type of garden would you plant? I would love to have raised beds, but I don't want the expense of buying soil when I think mine is more than adequate. I grew up watching my grandparents rototill a big square and plant, but is that the best way to begin an in-ground garden today? What are the alternatives? Okay, so let's separate that, because those are two totally different questions. Should I have raised beds? Should I rototill a big plot and just plant it? Let's start off with the raised bed question. There's two reasons that somebody puts in a raised bed: because you need it, or kind of need it, or because you want it. So let's start off with need. If you live somewhere where your soil really sucks, it's a quick way to onboard to good quality soil, because whatever you put in the bed, you have. If you live in a place like I do, where your soil depth is like that, and then you're on rock, right? Or maybe you're putting a community garden in a parking lot, because that happens. Well, you're in a situation where you have to, right? If you're like me and you have a bunch of these little critters running around and you don't really want to fence them out, so not only do you have the shallow soils, but you have ducks that will go in and eat everything. Generally I've found that about 30 inches of height keeps ducks out most of the time anyway, enough that they're not a problem. So there can be reasons. Another reason could be you have a really high water table to where your plants are actually getting their roots anaerobic in the garden. So there's some reasons that you might do this. Another reason would be, this is more of a want than a need, but it can become a need because your significant other, your HOA, whatever, doesn't like an in-ground garden, and up above the ground defined raised bed makes somebody else happy, so you're adapting to a social design consideration. Like, those are all reasons that you might need or sort of need a raised bed. The other reason you might need or want a raised bed would just be that you want the aesthetics, or you want the convenience of having this very clear delineation that this is lawn and this is garden, and maybe putting some paths in between them and things like that. You can do that without a raised bed that's contained, but it can be a little bit more difficult to maintain, right? However, let me say this: if I had really great soil, or even if I had just deep soil, I probably wouldn't build a confined raised bed with the added cost of the materials and labor that go into doing that. I would probably just plant in the ground. For many years as a young man, I took care of my grandfather's garden, and we had about a quarter acre of garden, and we probably gardened half of that because the other half was pathways. All we did, where they were 25 foot by 4 foot beds, and we just dug them every year. We never rototilled. Had I known what I know now as a young man, I would save myself an ass load of work, and I would have just tarped the beds at the end of every season and pulled the tarps away, and I would have had a lot less grass to edge out. The way that I did that back then is I would take a stake with a string wrapped around it, put it in the ground, unwrap it, and make a nice straight line, and use a tool called an edger, which is basically just a flat, it's basically a hoe on edge, and I would edge and then double dig the whole bed. And I did a lot of digging like that, incorporate some compost and things like that, and then plant directly into the ground. And our garden was fantastic. We also lived in a place with incredible soils in one of the most fertile parts of Pennsylvania, in some bottomland where, when erosion occurred elsewhere, it ended up settling in on us. So it was really easy to do that way. It was also a lot of work to dig every year. I can't tell you whether you should do kind of like weed blocker everywhere but the beds, or you should just do beds and just try to keep the weeds. Like, you got to figure that out for yourself. What I will tell you is rototilling every year is not what I would recommend. There's a couple problems with rototilling. Let's talk about what it does well, and that is, if there's any sods or anything up on the top that have encroached in the bed, it's a real easy mechanical way to get rid of that. And I don't have problem with using rototilling for establishment. We use it once, the rototiller goes away, it gets loaned out to friends, it gets done another project, but we don't till anymore. The two big problems with tilling is one, we basically kill the soil life when we rototill, which is why it works. For a period, tilling works and it declines in how well it works over time, right? So we kill all the critters and basically we're making an on-the-fly compost, which sounds like a good thing, except that every time the soil begins to restructure and begins to get into the natural system that we're looking for, it's another season and we till it again. And we eventually kind of burn out the microbes up in the root layer that we're planting into. We got really great mechanically defined structure, but you'll find that every year it takes more work, not less work, to till. Because there's life there, right? It'll come back, but it never gets to truly establish. It doesn't maintain that crumby soil structure that we're looking for. The other thing is, so your tiller only goes so deep, right? So if your tiller reaches down this far, what do you think happens right below where it reaches? What happens when something goes thump, 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 thump on Earth? It compacts. So you're actually, every time you till it, you're creating this upper fluffy layer and you're compacting a hard pan beneath your soil. So what's the solution? The solution is we use something like a broad fork to simply loosen it and we pull out any weeds that have encroached. We tarp in the off season so that we don't have encroachment of Bermuda grass, which is the Satan spawn, or maybe we cover crop in the interim. And those are all valid ways to do things. And like one of the greatest cover crops you can use for this, it's not going to give you a bunch of nitrogen or anything, but it's going to give you great root mass. It's going to feed earthworms. It's going to be real easy to deal with. And it's stupid cheap. Annual ryegrass. Since it's annual ryegrass, it's going to die. It's going to summer kill. And you can, when you go to plant in your spring, you can take a scythe and just drop it. You can take a weed whacker and drop it. You can take a roller and roll it flat like a tatami mat and then just plant into it. And some of it will come back, but your vegetables are going to grow much more aggressively. And as they get into the peak of the season, as the soil really warms, the ryegrass it's done, right? And if you roll it, it's great because you don't have to have a really high-end roller. You literally could have one of those blue 30-gallon barrels with, half full of water and throw it on the bed and just roll it, right? Because when you bend the stalk, you could walk it flat, right? Once you bend the stalk, you wound it and it kind of just dies there and it's perfect mulch. You can maintain your garden in a clover situation if your climate will allow for it. So we put down something like New Zealand or Dutch white clover, and at the highest that stuff gets is about like that. You can always cut it back a little bit if you need to, and basically wherever you want to plant, you just pull some out, make a hole, and plant your plants or your seeds down into it. That's a very Fukuoka thing. There's a lot of ways to do this, and you have to determine based on how much you want to garden, how much you want to produce, how much maintenance you want to do, how much work you want to do, how you want to do things, and above all, what you want it to look like. But I really think that people need to understand that raised beds, as we think of them, because there's two ways to do raised beds, really. Well, there's hundreds, but there's two main ways. One is non-defined by additional material, which means we just basically make a raised bed. But there's no 2x4s, there's no timbers, there's no cinder block, whatever. And there's nothing wrong with that. And it's a technique where as we bring in amendments, we just we make these little hills and we plant onto them. If you're going to do that, it is really, 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 really a good idea, number one, to put down some sort of weed block in your rows, at least initially, to mulch your rows heavily with wood mulch. And when I say heavily, I mean deep, right? So that maybe your bed doesn't even look like there's that much to it, because you want to control those rows from having encroachment of weeds and things like that. The other thing is, so now your wood chips break down over a season, and then next season you just take all of your broken down beautiful wood chips and put that onto your bed as mulch and put down another row. See, so now we're just dropping wood chips and we're folding and dropping and folding and dropping. It's a very, very effective way to do things. If you look at what they've done, The Australian PRI. That's exactly how the gardens are maintained out there. They have chicken tractors going around producing compost, and then they have raised beds that are not contained, right? They're just maintained like that. This is the thing. It's a very large garden there, but they also have what? A shitload of people that work for free because they come there to learn. The beauty of a defined raised bed is it creates such a mechanism of control that as soon as you see anything growing inside that defined perimeter, it's not supposed to be there. Yank. Yank. And this is what you'll find about raised beds. And it's something we're going to talk about more in the future here. If you make a fairly deep raised bed, something in the neighborhood of 10 inches or deeper, it will cost you more money to fill it unless you have some source of fill than it will cost you to build it. The construction cost is not that much. Landscape timbers are stupid cheap. Please stop worrying about it's treated wood. I don't want to get into that today. Just if you're worried about the chemicals in a landscape, not a railroad tie, that's creosote. In a landscape timber, I suggest you stop breathing because the toxins that you're taking in exceed the toxins if you extracted them from that, and it doesn't work that way. I'll let it go there, but in general, the cost of the fill exceeds the cost of the bed itself. But here's another thing to think about. If you just want a defined perimeter, you can put in a fairly low raised bed, 6 inches. You can come into that, kill your grass layer by whatever, you solarize it with plastic, cut it out, sod cut it, whatever you want to do. You can put down a layer or two of cardboard soaked, and then that 6 inches, you can fill it 2. Just fill it 2 inches. It doesn't matter. The plant doesn't care that there's a space there. In fact, it might actually be beneficial. It might be more water-wise. And then every year, as you're adding mulch, as you're adding compost, you're slowly building soil up, and you have space to do it with. That's another way to approach it. I put in 30-inch raised beds. I don't put 30 inches of fill in them. I put about 26 inches of fill in them. I leave myself 4 inches to grow soil over the years. So there's a lot of ways to cut those costs. It comes down to personal preference, and it also comes down to budget and size. The bigger the garden, the more expense there is in constructing raised beds. The smaller the garden, it's so cheap it doesn't matter. If you're putting in, if your plan is I want to put in 4x8 beds, I'd probably build some sort of raised bed just because of the convenience. This is another thing to think about. Stacking time, we talk about a lot in permaculture. So we plant way more trees than we need in a space, and then we take certain ones out as the forest emerges. That's one way to think of stacking in time. There's another way to think of stacking in time, though, is stacking in human time. The human. The older you get, the less of this is comfortable to do, and the harder it is to bend all the way to the ground. So if we build a raised bed, we can build a raised bed. Like my 30-inch raised beds are really easy to work on. And I put 2x6s on them to make benches. So when I'm working in that bed, guess what I do? I plop my ass right on that 2x6 bench, and I can work my garden without bending over at all. And when you're doing a lot of planting, that's convenient too. So that's another reason you might want versus need raised beds. But maybe you want it now, but maybe you need it later. And if you build raised beds correctly, you can always add courses down the road. So even if we use a really rough construction material, but will last longer than a human lifetime, like let's say cinder block, and let's say we go in and we put a single row of cinder blocks in for our raised bed. Maybe we even paint them so they look pretty or whatever. And we get that raised bed going for a couple of years, and a few years down the road, now we can spread out the expense. We can come in and put a second course. We should really think about the fact that we might want to do it in the future so that they're designed to be staggered. We put a second course in, and we start building up. And over years, the bed might go up to 3 courses of cinder block. I think they're 8 inches, so that would be 24 inches. Trust me, a 24-inch high-raised bed is much more comfortable to work as you age and your back has issues and stuff like that than one that's 4 inches or straight flat on the ground. But I would shy away from putting it on a large install. I would shy away from going with raised beds everywhere. I really would. And if you look at any of the large market gardeners or things like that, they don't do it because it's cost prohibitive. Except, one more before I go today. There is always the opportunity to source your raised bed material very, very inexpensively. If I had a property that was covered in black locust trees, that's an incredibly long, it'll last 100-year timber. You know, and if you have a bunch of them that are about like the bollwoods about that big around, man, a chainsaw and some spikes, and you're knocking out raised beds cheap. And then even if we're not completely filling them, they can be built up over time. And I know you're thinking, but black locust is allelopathic. It's very mildly allelopathic compared to most allelopathic trees. And this is something else that you need to understand. When you're talking about allelopathic trees, it's generally the green stems, the seeds, and the husks of anything they produce that's allelopathic. Much more allelopathic than black locust would be. And that allelopathic means it actually suppresses the growth of other plants. Maybe not all, but some. So the juglone species like black walnut, pecan, and all are highly allelopathic, but their lumber's not. If you build, I don't know why you would, like the black walnut is such a valuable timber, but if you built a raised bed out of black walnut timbers, it's not going to be allelopathic. If you mulch with black walnut nut husks and leaves, you will kill 90% of what you do that with. And also realize nature has ways of dealing with a lot of this. We had 2 huge black walnut trees just outside of our garden in Pennsylvania. Never was a problem. Of course, we didn't put the leaves in the bed. So anyway, long one again today. Thought that was going to be a quick one, but it wasn't. So anyway, hope you guys learned some things today. Keep them coming. Remember, we is the place to tell me what we want to hear. Take care, guys.